My father threw me out at 16 with nothing but a trash bag and $200. So I spent 12 years building an empire from scratch, and the moment his body started failing, he had the nerve to come crawling back asking for my kidney. The subject line said, "Urgent family matter." He couldn't even spell urgent. I hovered over the delete button so many times I lost count. 3 days I let that email sit there, unopened, like something radioactive. Then, like the idiot I apparently still was when it came to Gerald, I clicked it. No greeting, no apology, no preamble, just, "Your father needs a kidney transplant. Get tested as a potential donor. Call me." Like he was asking me to return a borrowed drill. Like 12 years of silence had been nothing more than a scheduling conflict. I slammed my laptop shut so hard the screen cracked. $800 to replace it, worth every single penny. I sat at my kitchen table in Seattle for a long time after that, staring at the fractured black screen, listening to the rain hit the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the bay. Puget Sound was dark and flat that evening, the kind of gray that swallows everything. I'd worked for 3 years to afford that view. I'd worked for every single thing in that apartment. The furniture, the car in the garage, the clothes in the closet, every piece of it, alone. And now Gerald, who hadn't spoken a word to me in 12 years, needed something that lived inside my body. I got up and poured 2 fingers of whiskey I didn't usually drink, and stood at those windows for a long time. Then I poured it out. I needed to think clearly, because something told me even then that this wasn't going to be simple. Gerald Marsh was 58 years old, and he had always operated under one foundational assumption, that the world owed him compliance, not respect, not affection, just the simple, quiet willingness of everyone around him to do what he needed done, when he needed it done, without complaint and without question. He'd built his entire adult life around that assumption. It had worked for him right up until it didn't. He was my father in the biological sense. That was the full extent of it. My mother, Claire, married him when I was 4 years old, and Gerald was 30, handsome in a blunt, workmanlike way, with a jawline and a truck and a confidence that probably looked like strength to a grieving young widow who needed someone to lean on. She had me from a relationship that hadn't lasted, and Gerald had no children of his own at the time, and for a while, for a few years, things were something close to functional. He wasn't warm. He wasn't the kind of man who showed up to school plays or helped with homework or knew what I was interested in, but he was present. He kept the lights on. He didn't drink. He didn't hit anyone. For a while, that felt like enough. Then his business partner, a man named Dale Creswick, introduced Gerald to a woman named Rhonda Bates at a company barbecue in the summer of 2001. I was 9. I don't know what happened between Gerald and Rhonda that summer, and I've never wanted to know. What I do know is that by October, my mother had lost 15 pounds without trying, that she stopped laughing the way she used to, and that Gerald started working late in a way that had nothing to do with work. By the following spring, my mother had been diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, 6 brutal months from the first scan to the funeral. I was 10 years old, and I sat beside her hospital bed 3 afternoons a week, and held her hand and watched her get smaller and smaller and disappear. I was in the hallway the last night she was lucid. I wasn't supposed to be there that late. A nurse had let me stay because she had a kind face and a soft spot for kids in bad situations, I think. The door was partway open. My mother's voice was barely a voice anymore. It was breath-shaped into words. She said, "Gerald, promise me. Promise me you will always put our son first. Always. Whatever happens, promise me." And Gerald, sitting in the chair beside her bed with his head bowed and his big hands wrapped around hers, said, "I promise, Claire. I swear to God, he'll always come first." He was crying. I saw his shoulders shake. I believed him completely. I was 10 years old and my mother was dying, and I needed to believe it, so I did. She died 4 days later. Gerald planned a nice funeral. He shook hands and accepted casseroles and cried at the graveside, and then came home and started making phone calls to Rhonda Bates. Rhonda moved in 18 months after my mother's funeral. She brought 2 boys, Tyler, who was a year older than me, and Connor, who was a year younger. She brought her furniture and her opinions, and an organizational philosophy that required significant restructuring of the household. The restructuring mostly involved me. I was moved from the larger bedroom I'd had since childhood into a smaller one at the back of the house. My mother's photographs came down from the living room walls. The dish my mother used to make shepherd's pie in was donated to Goodwill without anyone asking me. Small things, constant things. The slow, methodical erasure of the life that had existed before Rhonda. I was 11. I told myself to be patient, to give it time. I gave it 5 years. By the time I was 16, Tyler and Connor had new bikes, new gaming setups, their own bathroom, and the full, uncomplicated affection of both of their parents. I had a room I wasn't sure I was allowed to decorate, and a place at the dinner table that felt more like a courtesy than a right. I had learned to be quiet. I had learned to take up as little space as possible. I had learned to read the temperature of a room before I entered it, and to disappear before anyone needed me to. I was a junior in high school. My GPA was 3.8. I'd never been in trouble, never broken curfew, never given anyone a real reason to complain about me beyond the fact of my existence. I came home from school on a Thursday in March 14th, 2007, which I know because I'd gotten a 94 on a history exam that day, and I was quietly proud of it. it, and my room was empty. Not messy, not rearranged. Empty. The bed was gone. The dresser was gone. The desk where I did my homework was gone. Garbage bags of my clothes and whatever personal items had survived the culling were stacked in the hallway, outside what had been my door. I found Gerald in the garage. He was fixing Connor's bike. A nice bike. A Trek that probably cost $400. I stood in the doorway and looked at him for a long moment before I spoke. I said, "My room is empty." He didn't stop working. He said, "Diane needs it for a craft space. The boys are getting older. They need room to spread out." I said, "Where am I supposed to go?" He looked up then. Not with shame, not with regret, with the mild impatience of someone who has already thought through a problem and doesn't understand why it's still being discussed. He said, "You're resourceful. You'll figure it out." He handed me $200 in cash and went back to the bike. I went to the hallway. I fit what I could into the garbage bags. I left before evening because he'd said I had until evening, and I didn't want to give him the satisfaction of having to tell me again. I was 16 years old. It was 42 degrees outside. I had $200, a garbage bag, and the 94 on my history exam. The first 3 months I stayed at my friend Danny Okafor's house in the Riverside neighborhood, sleeping on his basement couch while his parents were too consumed by their own divorce proceedings to notice one extra body in the house. I got a job at a diner called Pearls on Route 9, working overnight shifts from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., 4 days a week. That was 40 hours. I made $7.20 an hour. After taxes, I brought home just under $260 a week, which covered food and bus fare and not much else. I wore 3 outfits on rotation. I washed them in Danny's bathroom sink and dried them on the shower rod overnight. Some weeks, when the math didn't work out, I shoplifted protein bars from the gas station on Kendall Street. I never stole anything I didn't need. I told myself that mattered. The Okafor situation collapsed in month 4 when Danny's mother moved back in, took stock of the household, and discovered me. She wasn't cruel about it. She was just clear. She had enough to manage. I understood. I couldn't tell Danny where I went. He would have felt guilty, and I didn't want that. I told him I'd found a place. I moved what I had into a locker at the bus station and started sleeping in the storage room at Pearls, slipping in after my shift ended, rolling out a flattened cardboard box on the floor behind the industrial shelving, setting an alarm on my phone for 5:45 so I'd be gone before the morning crew arrived. The owner of Pearls was a 63-year-old Korean-American veteran named James Han. He'd owned the place for 21 years. He caught me on a Tuesday morning in October when I miscalculated and he arrived at 6:15 instead of 7. I was folding up my cardboard when the back door opened. He stood there for a long moment. He looked at the cardboard. He looked at me. He looked at the locker with my clothes in it that I'd started keeping in the corner. He said, "Come upstairs." Above the diner was a one-room apartment that he'd been using for storage. He cleared a path through the boxes that morning. He put a cot in the corner. He gave me a key. He said, "Don't make me regret this." That was all. He never brought it up again. He never made it an act of charity I was supposed to feel indebted to. He just did it, the way a decent person does a necessary thing. I have never stopped being grateful for James Han. I don't think I ever will. I finished high school in that one-room apartment above Pearls. Junior year and half of senior year, studying at the diner after my shift, surviving on staff meals and determination, and a quality of anger that had started to feel less like rage and more like fuel. I graduated with a 3.7 GPA and no one in the audience for me. Not one person. I taught myself to code on library computers in the evenings. I was at that library every day it was open, sometimes until they turned the lights off and the librarian walked the stacks to clear everyone out. I applied to every scholarship I could find. I got into the local community college on financial aid, transferred after 2 years to the University of Washington on a combination of merit scholarships and $62,000 in federal student loans, and graduated at 23 with a computer science degree and a job offer from a software company in Seattle called Arrowwood Systems. I moved into a studio apartment in Capitol Hill with a mattress on the floor and a folding table from Target. I worked, I saved, I got promoted, I built things. I taught myself more than any program had taught me. By 27, I'd moved to a senior engineering role. By 30, I was leading a team of 11 people and pulling in a salary that would have felt fictional to the kids sleeping on cardboard at Pearls. At 32, I had the apartment with the windows overlooking the bay. I had a girlfriend named Mara Chen, a clinical psychologist with dark eyes and a laugh that could reset a bad day in under a minute. I had a savings account and a retirement account and a therapist I saw every other Tuesday and a life that was genuinely, concretely good. And then the email arrived. I didn't respond. I deleted it. Or I tried to. I moved it to trash and then went back and looked at it 3 more times before I permanently deleted it at 11 p.m. on a Wednesday. I told Mara about it over dinner that Friday, setting my phone on the table and watching her read it. She looked up slowly. She said, "He hasn't spoken to you in 12 years and his opening line is 'Give me your kidney'?" I said, "That's the whole email." She said, "What are you going to do?" I said, "Nothing. I'm going to do nothing." She nodded carefully, the way she did when she was deciding whether to push. She didn't push. She just reached across the table and put her hand over mine, and that was enough. But then the second email came. This one from Rhonda's address, 2 days after I deleted Gerald's. The subject line was, "From your stepmother." She had never once in 20 years referred referred to herself as my stepmother. The message was 11 lines. I remember most of them verbatim. She wrote, "Family is family, regardless of past difficulties. Your father is critically ill. He needs a kidney transplant, and you are his closest biological match. I don't know what grievances you are holding on to, but this is not the time. We raised you. We gave you a home and years of our lives, and this is how you repay the people who sacrificed for you? Stop being a child. Your father could die. Call us." I read it 4 times. I showed it to Mara. She read it once, set the phone down, looked at me for a long moment, and said, "The woman who had you removed from your home at 16 is calling you ungrateful." I drafted a response that night. 17 drafts. Each one started controlled and became something else by the 3rd paragraph. I deleted all of them. I blocked Rhonda's address. I blocked Gerald's. But something had cracked open that I thought had calcified long ago. I stopped sleeping well. My focus at work started fraying at the edges. I submitted a pull request with 3 obvious errors that a junior engineer on my team caught during review, which had never happened before. My manager, a sharp woman named Priya Nair, pulled me aside after the 3rd day in a row where I'd been visibly somewhere else. She said, "You've been off. This isn't you. What's going on?" I told her the truth, the whole thing. She listened without interrupting, which was unusual for her. She said, "Take 2 weeks, paid. Come back when you're ready." I used the first week to do what I can only describe as fall apart quietly. I ran in the mornings until my legs gave out. I sat with Mara in the evenings and talked through things I'd never said out loud to anyone. I called my therapist, Dr. Reyes, and we did 3 sessions in 5 days. By the end of the first week, I had located the thing that was actually bothering me underneath all the anger. I needed to look Gerald in the eyes, not to reconcile, not to forgive, just to make him say it, to his face, without the buffer of a screen. I booked a flight home on a Sunday night. Mara drove me to the airport. She said, "Whatever happens, you're not doing this because you owe him anything. You know that, right?" I said, "I know." She said, "Call me when you land." I called her when I landed. The house was in worse shape than I'd expected. The paint on the siding was peeling in long strips. The lawn had gone patchy and unkempt. The front gutter had partially detached and was hanging at an angle. There was a wheelchair ramp installed over the front steps that hadn't been there before, unpainted pine boards that looked recent and cheap. I sat in the rental car in the driveway for 4 minutes before I got out. Rhonda answered the door. She'd aged in the way that hard years age people, her face more angular, the softness of her 40s replaced by something tighter and more guarded. Her hair was showing gray at the roots through the blonde. When she recognized me, her face moved through several things quickly before settling on something carefully neutral. She said, "You came." I said, "Where is he?" She led me through the house without another word. The living room had been rearranged to accommodate a recliner, positioned in front of the television, and beside it, a dialysis machine on a wheeled cart, squat and white and humming with a quiet, mechanical indifference. Gerald sat in the recliner. He'd lost at least 50 pounds from the man I remembered. His skin had the grayish undertone of kidneys that were no longer doing their job. His hands, always so big and competent, looked thin on the armrests. He didn't look up when I walked in. I stood in the middle of the living room and waited. He said, "So you finally showed up." The same flat tone, the same mild contempt, the same inflection he'd always used when I disappointed him by existing in a way that was inconvenient. I said, "You promised her, Gerald. On her deathbed. You promised you would always put me first." He looked up then. His eyes were the same, pale, gray, unreadable. He said, "Your mother was emotional. She was dying and she was scared and she didn't understand how blended families work. You were fine. You turned out fine." Fine. Something shifted in my chest. Not rage. I'd expected rage. Prepared for it. Contained it. Something colder than rage. Something that had been building for 22 years and had finally finished building. I said, "I slept in a storage room at 16. I worked 40-hour weeks through my entire junior year of high school. I put myself through college on $62,000 in debt that took me 8 years to pay off. I did all of that without a single dollar from you, without a phone call, without a text message. Don't you dare say you had anything to do with how I turned out. Don't you dare take that," Rhonda said from behind me. "We gave you a home for 16 years. We fed you and housed you, and this is the gratitude." I turned around. I said, "You pushed him to kick me out so your boys could have more space. That is the truth. I know it's the truth. You know it's the truth. Don't rewrite history standing in front of me." Her face went red. Gerald's hands tightened on the armrests. He said, "You'd let me die over an old grudge. What kind of man does that?" I looked at him for a long moment. I thought about what kind of man he was. I thought about Claire and her hands and the way the light looked in that hospital room on the nights I sat with her. I thought about the cardboard on Pearl's storage room floor. I thought about the 94 on my history exam that no one had ever known about, that I'd carried alone, that I was still somehow carrying. I said, "The kind you raised." He started coughing, a deep, wet, structural sound that came from somewhere that wasn't working right. Rhonda crossed the room to him fast, adjusting something on the dialysis line, her hand on his back. She turned to look at me with an expression I hadn't expected. Not hatred, exactly. Something closer to terror, and beneath it something that might have been shame if she'd let herself feel it. She said, "Get out. You've done enough." I walked out. I sat in the rental car in the driveway and my hands shook on the steering wheel for 7 minutes. I timed it on the dashboard clock because I needed something concrete to focus on. When the shaking stopped, I drove to the Hampton Inn 6 miles away, checked in, opened my laptop, and did something I should have done before I booked the flight. I started researching living kidney donation. What I found was not what I expected. I knew in a general sense that living donors had to volunteer, that it wasn't a transaction, that hospitals didn't just harvest organs because a family member asked, but the actual infrastructure around it was more substantial than I'd understood. Living donors undergo 4 to 6 months of medical evaluation, psychological evaluation, independent advocacy review. Transplant centers are legally required to have an independent donor advocate, a separate physician whose only job is to represent the donor's interests, not the recipient's. The evaluation process is specifically designed to identify and remove coercion. A donor can withdraw at any point for any reason, and the transplant center is required to protect their confidentiality. They can tell the recipient simply that the donor was medically unsuitable, removing the social pressure entirely. Gerald couldn't force me. He couldn't guilt the hospital into it. The system, for once, was built with the more vulnerable person in mind. But then I kept reading, and I found the thing that changed the temperature of the room. I found a thread on a legal forum, a discussion between estate attorneys about living donor situations and family estates. One of the attorneys had referenced a case in which a family member had been pressured to donate by being promised a share of the estate and then cut out of the will after the donation was complete. Another attorney had replied with a similar case. A third had mentioned something I hadn't considered, that in states without specific living donor protections, a recipient's family could theoretically contest a refusal to donate as grounds for removing a donor from an estate. I didn't have an estate to worry about. Gerald and I had no financial relationship, but the thread linked to a secondary discussion that caught my eye, a mention of life insurance, specifically beneficiary designations. I'd been Gerald's son for 16 years. I had never had reason to think about whether he'd ever name me as a beneficiary on anything. Why would I? We hadn't spoken in 12 years. He had Rhonda, he had Tyler, he had Connor, but I had a gut feeling that I'd learned over 32 years to respect. I called my college roommate, Marcus Webb, who'd gone to law school and now practiced estate law in Portland. It was 10:30 at night. He picked up on the third ring. I explained the situation in full. He listened without interrupting, the way good lawyers and good friends both do. When I finished, he said, "You need to request a copy of any existing beneficiary designations on his policies. You're entitled to that information if you're named. You should also find out if there's a will and when the last revision was." I said, "How do I do that without asking Gerald?" He said, "You don't ask Gerald. You ask the insurance companies directly. You'll need his social security number, which, do you have that?" I did. My mother had kept important documents in a fireproof lockbox that had come to me when she died. I'd kept it through every move, through the storage room and the apartment, and every iteration of my life since. Gerald had never asked for it back. I don't know if he'd ever thought about it. I had his social security number. I had his date of birth. I had his mother's maiden name, which was listed on his birth certificate, which was also in the box. I spent the next day making phone calls. I worked through 3 insurance companies before I found it. Gerald had a life insurance policy, a term policy taken out in 1999, the year before my mother got sick. The death benefit was $400,000. I was listed as the sole primary beneficiary. He had never changed it. I sat with that information for a full hour before I understood what it meant. It meant that Rhonda knew, or suspected, or had recently discovered. It meant that the email campaign, the demand for my kidney, the appeal to family loyalty, the accusation of ingratitude, had a possible secondary function I hadn't seen coming. Because if Gerald died, and I was still the named beneficiary, Rhonda and the boys got nothing from that policy. But if I was in contact with the family, if I was enmeshed in the situation, if I was emotionally compromised and operating from guilt, I might make decisions that help them manage that problem. Or worse, if Gerald recovered because I donated and then revised his policy before he died, I'd have given a kidney to a man who was actively working to cut me out of the one thing my mother had ever indirectly arranged to leave me. I called Marcus back that night. He said, "Don't change anything. Don't contact them. Let me make some calls in the morning." I said, "Is any of this legal?" He said, "Depends on what they do next. Right now, they've sent some emails. That's not illegal. But if they try to contest the beneficiary designation, or if there's been any recent document activity, new will, new forms, that could get interesting. Get me everything you have." I sent him everything I had. The next morning, Marcus called me at 7:45. He'd done some digging through professional channels I didn't ask about and didn't need to know about. He said, "Gerald's will was revised 11 months ago. You are not in the will. Tyler and Connor split the estate evenly, with Rhonda holding the house outright. But the insurance policy, that's a beneficiary designation, not a testamentary document. The will doesn't override it. He would have had to change the beneficiary form directly with the insurance company." I said, "Did he?" Marcus paused for a beat. He said, "There was an inquiry made to the insurance company 7 months ago requesting the forms to change the beneficiary designation. The forms were sent. They were never returned." I let that land. Gerald had tried to cut me out. He'd gotten the forms. He hadn't sent them them back. Maybe he'd lost them. Maybe he'd forgotten. Maybe he'd been too sick by then. Or maybe, and this was the possibility that sat in my chest in a strange way, some part of him hadn't been able to make himself do it. I was never going to know which one it was. That was the grief in it. That was the thing I had to carry regardless of how the rest of this played out. I flew home the next morning. I called Rhonda from the airport. She answered on the second ring, which told me she'd been waiting. I said, I know about the policy, Rhonda, the life insurance policy from 1999. I know I'm the primary beneficiary. I know the will was revised 11 months ago. I know Gerald requested the forms to change the beneficiary designation 7 months ago and never submitted them. Silence. I said, I am not going to donate a kidney to Gerald. That is my final answer, and I have both the legal right and the institutional support of the transplant system to enforce it. No hospital is going to pressure me, and you don't have the legal standing to compel me. She said, you're going to let him die. I said, Gerald made choices, 16 years of them. I'm not responsible for where those choices landed him. And I want you to hear this clearly. If there is any attempt to contest the beneficiary designation, or any legal action taken against me, or any further contact from you or your sons that constitutes harassment, Marcus Webb in Portland will have paperwork filed within 48 hours. Do you understand me? Another silence. Longer this time. She said, you're cruel. You're a cruel, ungrateful. I hung up. I sat in the airport terminal and watched planes move on the tarmac and felt something I hadn't expected. Not triumph, not even relief. Something quieter. A sadness that had no target. A grief for the life that should have existed. The one where Gerald had kept the promise he'd made to my mother. Where I'd had a home and a father and hadn't needed to sleep on cardboard at 16 to understand that I was worth something. That life hadn't existed. It was never going to. I couldn't mourn it forever. Tyler called me 3 days after I got back to Seattle. I didn't recognize the number and I answered out of reflex. He said, I know you talked to Mom. I said, I did. He said, I think she's known about the policy for a while. I didn't know until last month. I want you to know I'm not going to do anything. I don't want to fight you. I hadn't spoken to Tyler in 12 years. He sounded like someone who'd grown up and wasn't entirely happy with what he'd grown up into. He said, for what it's worth, I knew it wasn't right. What they did to you. I was 12 and I didn't know what to do about it, but I knew. I didn't know what to do with that either. I said, thank you for calling, Tyler. He said, Dad's not doing great. I don't know how long he has. I said, I'm sorry. I meant it. Not for Gerald exactly. For Tyler, who'd watched all of it happen too and apparently had carried some version of it himself. For the family that could have been something decent and hadn't been. Gerald died 9 weeks later. Renal failure. He was on the transplant list, but a match never came through in time. I found out through Marcus, who'd been monitoring the situation. He called me on a Tuesday morning and said, it happened last night. I'm sorry. I took the day off. Mara came home early. We sat together on the couch with the windows open and the sound of the city coming in, and I cried in a way I hadn't cried since I was 10 years old, sitting in a hospital hallway, listening through a gap in a door. Not for Gerald, for Claire, for the boy who had loved his mother so much that he'd carried her lockbox through 17 addresses over 22 years and never once thought about what was in it. The insurance policy paid out 63 days after Gerald's death. The check, $412,000 including accumulated interest, arrived on a Thursday afternoon. I held it for a long time. I donated $50,000 to a nonprofit that provides emergency housing and workforce training to homeless teenagers. I did it anonymously. I did it because of James Hahn and a cot in a storage room and a key handed over without commentary, and because some debts are not the kind you repay to the person who gave them to you. You repay them forward to the next person sleeping on cardboard who needs someone to open a door. The rest I invested, responsibly. With a financial advisor Mara's brother recommended. I still live in Seattle, still have the apartment with the windows. Mara and I got engaged in October of that year. At a dinner neither of us had planned to be romantic. We were splitting a takeout pizza and she said, completely without ceremony, I think we should get married. And I said yes before she finished the sentence. The wedding was small, 31 people in a state park outside Olympia on a Saturday in June. Mr. Hahn came. He was 81 years old and he danced at the reception, and I made sure he had the good seat with the view. I still see Dr. Reyes every other Tuesday. We've talked about Gerald more times than I can count, from more angles than I thought there were. What I've come to, after all of it, is something I couldn't have articulated at 32, but can articulate now. Gerald made a promise to my mother and broke it. Not because he was a monster, because he was weak and selfish, and he loved Rhonda more than he'd loved the idea of the man he'd told a dying woman he would be. That's a human failure. An ordinary, grinding, devastating kind of human failure. I lived inside the wreckage of it for 22 years, but the wreckage was also, in its way, the foundation. Every piece of what I built, the engineering degree, the career, the apartment, the life, I built because I had to, because no one else was going to do it, because the only option available to me was to be exactly as resourceful as Gerald had, offhandedly, cruelly predicted I would be. He was right. I figured it out. I just wish it hadn't cost what it cost. My mother asked him to put me first. He didn't, but somewhere in the architecture of a policy he took out in 1999 and never got around to changing, maybe, in the most indirect and accidental way imaginable, he finally did. I'm not sure that's forgiveness, but it's what I have, and standing where I'm standing now, with Mara asleep in the next room and Seattle spread out beyond the windows in the dark, it turns out that's enough.